Israel, it should have been a week of double celebration. Winning the Eurovision Song Contest, even though when I last looked at a map, it isn't even part of Europe. And welcoming the symbolic move of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Unpopular even with America's allies and provocative for the rest of the Middle East. But widely welcomed by most Israelis as cementing the ancient city as the country's capital. Everything, however, was overshadowed by the chaos and carnage on Israel's border with Gaza, as the Palestinians protested and the Israeli Defense Force responded with deadly firepower. 60 Palestinians were shot dead, almost 3,000 wounded from tear gas, shrapnel and gunfire. Many legs were amputated. The world recoiled at the slaughter and largely condemned it. Israel said Hamas, that's the hardline grouping which runs Gaza and doesn't recognise Israel's right to exist, it said that Hamas had attempted a 40,000-strong invasion of protesters, many armed, with the aim of attacking Jewish communities close to the fence, which separates Gaza from Israel. So it had the right to defend its territory using all necessary force. But many were still left wondering why sophisticated and well-trained forces could not deal with hostile crowds and serious unrest without resorting to mass casualties. Here's journalist Dan Hodges with his take of the week.
Thousands of miles away from the front line, it's very easy to form assumptions and make accusations. A popular narrative, one often prosecuted without analysis, is that Israel is a brutal pariah state existing on the oppression and subjugation of the Palestinian people. Again this week, we've seen Israel blamed for the bloodshed on its border with Gaza. But in reality, the Israeli government has simply been trying to defend its citizens and its territory, just as we would expect the British government to defend us if we were under attack. Yes, Donald Trump's decision to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem was unnecessarily provocative. But Hamas have used that and Israel's 70th anniversary to exploit tensions. The so-called protest alongside the border fence wasn't peaceful. Hamas operatives were armed with guns, with knives and with bombs. And their stated intention was to enter Israel and kill. I'll ask this question. If the Israeli security forces had allowed Hamas to successfully breach the border, what do people think would have happened next? The reality is Hamas remains committed to the destruction of Israel. I've visited an Israeli kibbutz close to that border fence. One of the residents told me how a farmer had been ploughing his field when his tractor fell into a giant hole. When the tractor was pulled out, they found a nearly completed Hamas tunnel. Then they searched the surrounding area and found a second tunnel, which was 100 yards from the local infant school. Terrorists have crossed that border and terrorists have murdered Israeli citizens. Faced with that reality, it's not surprising that Israeli troops opened fire with live rounds. Any innocent death is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy whose responsibility rests first and foremost with Hamas.
And Dan Hodges is with us now. Welcome. Now, even if Hamas was behind the protests, and I think the evidence is clear that it was, even if some of the protesters were armed and dangerous, and the evidence is that some were, still wasn't the Israeli response disproportionate?
Not if you think about what the reaction would have been if the border fence had been breached. I mean, as I said, Hamas were very explicit about what their intention was. They wanted to breach the border fence because they then wanted to infiltrate their fighters and their terrorists into those
But if they had done that, they
communities.
could then have been taken on by Israeli anti-riot forces, which would... Instead, Israel used snipers.
But you've still...
How could you use snipers against protesters?
Well, I mean, you're saying protesters, but the point is these were not protests. This was not a demonstration. This was a coordinated, specific attempt to breach the fence with the aim of then entering those communities and then murdering people within those communities. And Hamas were
but that wasn't
completely
aim of all
open about the intention.
40,000. There were some. Hamas had seeded people among them. It's an old technique.
Hamas...
I grant you all that. But I guess, I mean, snipers against even this kind of dangerous protest seems unusual for a democracy. And surely a democracy faced with serious social unrest, surely it has to learn how to handle that without resorting to mass fatalities.
Well,
I mean, we learned the hard way with Bloody Sunday, didn't we?
Well, no, but that's the point. I mean, that's the point I was going to say. I mean, you say it's unusual for a democracy. Unfortunately, we have a history within our own society.
Which has haunted us ever since.
Well, it has, but obviously the situation in Gaza, as I said, the reality is what were the options available to the Israeli security forces? The water cannon, rubber bullets aren't effective. They're only really effective at close range. And as I said, the intention was to breach the fence with the intention of murdering Israeli civilians.
What do you say to Dan's argument, Liz?
I said nobody is denying Israel's right to, defend its borders and defend itself against terrorism, but it doesn't give them the right to fire on unarmed citizens. I mean, hundreds of children were injured. And you're right, Andrew, I believe it was completely disproportionate.
But Hamas has admitted that 50 of the 60 killed were Hamas militants.
And as I've said, defending yourself against terrorists, nobody's denying that.
But that's the ones they killed.
The hundreds of children who were injured and 1,000 more people who were protesting.
Why would you take a child to a protest like that?
Because I think many people who were there, I'm not denying that Hamas has manipulated this for its own ends, but many people were there genuinely protesting against the appalling situation in Gaza. And my fear of all of this is that we're in this death cycle of despair, and the lack of leadership from both Israel and the Palestinians means that innocent Israelis and Palestinians are suffering.
But I think I wouldn't necessarily disagree with the sort of the lack of leadership on all sides in regards to the general situation. But in relation to that specific incident and that specific security threat, and sorry to come back to this, as I said, it wasn't a protest. These were not people who were simply protesting about the Palestinians.
Dan.
No, but the point is, Hamas were very explicit about what they were intending to do. They coordinated the action and they wanted to breach the fence so they could kill people.
I agree with Dan entirely that Hamas is responsible. But the reason that Hamas did this was that it wanted to provoke a reaction which would bring hatred upon Israel. And it has achieved that. So it's disappointing from Israel's own point of view that the way it has reacted would be exactly what Hamas wanted to happen. It's quite interesting to step back for a moment and recall that Israel, the reason there is a self-governing Gaza is that Israel withdrew its settlements from Gaza, a single case where this has happened. And more broadly, I would say what has disappointed me enormously about Israeli policy for the last 10 or 20 years has been the settlements policy. Because settling land that was taken over after the 1967 war makes any two-state solution virtually impossible.
These are on the West Bank settlements.
And the reason that there have been an increasing number of settlements which have complicated it so much is that Israeli politics are dictated by the most extreme parties, because under their electoral system, the most extreme parties get pretty strong representation in parliament, even if their popular vote is quite small. And Israel continues to attract, as immigrants, militants, particularly from the United States, who are more and more pushing Israeli policy towards these extremes. So that there are many Israelis, I mean, possibly even a majority of Israelis, who are quite shocked by a lot of Israeli policy.
the peace process is effectively dead. The Palestinian cause is in decline, even in the Middle East. Maybe the Israelis just think they can do what they want now.
Well, no, I mean, if you look at the response from the Israeli security forces, I mean, picking up the point that Michael's made, I mean, they have accepted that in PR terms, this has been a disaster. I mean, they've openly accepted that. But what they've argued as well is they are not in a position when they have the integrity of Israeli territory threatened and, crucially, Israeli lives under threat in this way, to look at a broader picture. Their primary responsibility has to be to prevent loss of life when they are facing attack, direct attack, as Hamas has admitted, from a terrorist organisation.
They didn't prevent loss of life. They killed 60 people and injured 3,000 others.
No, obviously, and you know, the loss of one innocent life is obviously, as I said, a tragedy. But as you pointed out, from Hamas's own admission, the vast majority of those that were killed were Hamas's own operatives.
So I wonder where we're going here, and that this is going to happen again and again now, because the Palestinian cause is now in retreat. The West Bank didn't rise up in protest about what had happened in Gaza. The rest of the Arab world, which I'm following very carefully, the response was surprisingly muted. And all Hamas has done is it's helped to turn Gaza into a hellhole, and it's nowhere to go.
Well,
there's no progress. There's no possible light at the end of this tunnel.
Both Hamas and Israel have indeed turned Gaza into a hellhole. But the problem seems to me, following up on what you were saying about appealing to extremists, I think that's what Israel is doing, but also the US has appealed. You know, Trump's moving the embassy to Jerusalem was also about appealing to his hard-right evangelical Christians, when really I think the only hope for getting any movement towards a two-state solution, which I still believe is the only viable option, is to work with the neighbouring Arab countries. And this is what really strikes me about Trump's move. It's not only weakened their influence in the peace process, it's not only weakened the case of people who are arguing for negotiation over violence, it's weakened the ability of countries like Saudi Arabia to form any kind of alliance or working relationship with Israel to curb the expansion of Iran
Saudi
in the
Arabia
area.
is Israel's new ally.
When people say Gaza is a hellhole, I mean, half a percentage of the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia would enrich everyone in Gaza and give them all the services they wanted, all the hospitals, all the schools. The fact is that Saudi Arabia and other Arab states are not interested in helping the people of Gaza, possibly because they don't agree with their political position, but probably also because it quite suits them to have this running sore that makes a villain of Israel on an almost daily basis.
See, I would put it to you, Dan, moving on from the actual incident itself and trying to see it in a broader context. The two-state peace process Liz is talking about, that's yesterday's politics. It's over now. It's gone. There's been not a scintilla of progress towards it. And while that rigor mortis has set in, it's the rise of Iran is the regional threat now to Israel and to Sunni Arab states. And the Palestinians have been sidelined in this because the tacit Israeli-Saudi alliance is now the new dynamic in the region. It's changed from the way it's been for the past 40 years.
It is. I mean, but if you speak to people in Israel, I mean, one of the things that they are obviously terrified of in relation to Iran, and in particular in relation to the Iran nuclear threat, is you have a situation where actually there is almost an Iranian nuclear umbrella thrown over the Gaza Strip
But in that standoff, the Saudis and other Sunni states are closer to Israel than they are to the Palestinians.
That's absolutely right. But I mean, I think that the broader problem. I mean, this is where I would agree with some of the critics. When you've got a situation where you have a Trump White House working with a sort of a Netanyahu presidency, and then you throw into the mix the Hamas leadership, you're absolutely right. I mean, the prospect for any sort of strategic process in the region is
Netanyahu may not be
zero.
there forever. Israelis want
Well, he may not be
to
there.
be
He may
safe.
not be there for that much longer.
And ultimately, there will have to be a solution to it. I don't deny the difficulties
but
of it.
storming the fence is not the solution, is it?
We'll leave it there. Dan, Hodges, thank you for being with us.